In,
We do. Hey. Yep, it looks perfect. I like that color scheme. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being here on time, even a few minutes early. We'll try to start pretty on time today because we always go over with Rabbi Pereira. There's always so much to say, which is, it's not a complaint. That's a good thing. There's always so much to say. And it's appreciated. So thank you all for being on time. Let's start. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Manuel, for starting us with where you're from. I was just going to ask if everyone can start putting in while we're waiting another 2-3 minutes until if you throw into the chat where you're signing in from. So we have Paris area, France. That's very helpful. Thank you. And today, this is where I am. And it's always nice to know. And if there is something that you think you want to share, or I'm monitoring the chat and it would be great. So we have from Portugal and New York and Strasbourg, Lisbon, Northampton, Massachusetts. Thank you all for telling us where you're signing in from. It's great to see that we are coming from across the world, although we kind of stopped midway through Europe, right? London. Okay, so we're still that end of the world. Okay, so I just had a comment that somebody will need to leave early. As always, you will receive the recording in a follow-up email, and it is on our YouTube channel. So, or it will be on our YouTube channel. So no worries, although it's always good to stay till the end because that's when you get to ask your questions. So thank you. We have Philadelphia. I'm actually going to be in Philadelphia tomorrow evening. I don't know, for those of you who are in that area, there will be a showing at the museum there of Jeannie Milgram's film. She's one of our co-hosts in this program. She has a documentary about her life as born a Catholic in born a Catholic in Cuba, yes. And she talks about her life and converting and then finding her whole history back to 24 grandmothers at this point. So complete matrilineal descent. So just interesting. Carolyn, it's so nice to see you again. I'm so happy to see that you were registered. So thank you for coming in. We have a bunch from around New York. Oh, from Rio. Wonderful. Thank you, Yvonne. Wonderful. Thank you for coming. We're going to take another minute or two, but like I said, tomorrow evening, Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia sponsoring Jeannie's film. So we'd love to see any of you there that are going to come. And if not, then you should definitely find a showing near you. There are going to be a few in Portugal and a few in Brazil in the near future. So Berkeley, California. I was waiting to get some West Coast, so thank you for telling us where you're signing in from. We'll give everybody one more minute. I know you didn't come to hear me, so I try to keep my talk to the minimum, but I like to give everybody a few minutes. So let's see. Richmond, okay. So thank you for those who are putting in where you're from. And again, as you need or you want, please do put your questions and comments into the chat. I will be monitoring them. If it's a specific question, you might want to put it into the Q&A. Continue to tell us things, and I will continue to monitor them. So I'm going to officially welcome you all. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all for joining us in the third part in our Sephardic Roots series. For those who didn't hear last week, we had Dr. Roger Martinez Davia, and that was a very interesting talk. And then before that, so all of these talks are on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to watch them. We encourage you to follow up, to send emails in. For those who are helping sponsor these programs, thank you for that as well. We do appreciate it. We can only do it with your help. That's how we run. So thank you all for those who are helping to sponsor, including our co-hosts. So like I said before, Jeannie Milgram, Reconnectar, the Certificate of Sephardic Heritage, the Jewish Studies Center in Virginia. Why am I blanking on that? Sorry about that. In Richmond, Virginia, and of course, the Jewish Unity Through Diversity Institute. So we are very pleased, and I'm going to give a brief intro because I feel like it's wrong not to give something, but at least I would like to welcome again a wonderful speaker and a scholar, Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Pereira, who is the Director of Adult Education at the Chabad of Virginia, Richmond. We will be receiving his contact information to follow up with him or with me. Rabbi Pereira was a professor of economics and has rabbinical ordination. He is the author or co-author of Jewish Ethics from Portugal and a few other books. He is widely published in lectures around the world on history of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula and the Sephardic world. So we are really, really pleased to be working with him on this series, and we're pleased to have all of you back. 1391, the beginning of the end. I pass it over to you, Rabbi Pereira.
Okay, thank you. It's always a delight to participate in this series and to share my thoughts about these things. Today, we are going to be talking about a date, 1391, which has not received a lot of attention, and it should, because it marks the beginning of a very sharp decline in terms of the safety and the accomplishments and everything of the Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula. So if you want to find a beginning for the process of eventually destruction of the Jewish presence, organized Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula, you go to 1391. Of course, this doesn't mean that there weren't problems before, but this is really a turning point in many, many different ways. And we will try today to understand how everything starts here when we start thinking about the issues that characterized the next few centuries in Spain and Portugal. And of course, I use Spain in a very generic term because, of course, there was no Spain back then. It's the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon and Navarra, and at this time, still the Caliphate of Granada. But we know that when we reached the time of the expulsion, basically the Jewish people, we were divided in three peoples, if you want. There were Jews proper, there were conversos, and let's assume for the sake of argument that conversos were the people that had converted and to Christianity and were sort of trying to be at least moderately good Christians. And the Morenos, and I fully realize that's not a politically correct term today, these days, but there were people that were crypto-Jews that were trying to continue Judaism in secret. And if we want to see how everything started and when everything started again, we have to go back to 1391. So what happened in 1391? Those are some of the questions we are going to address. What happened? What type of problems did it lead to? What problems for Jews? What problems for the Christians? And basically, how did everything end up? So we are going to start by just thinking a little bit about the vibes of the time to get a good sense of what the time period was and what Jewish life was and so forth. And then we are going to look at the events of 1391, and then we are going to look at the third part, at the consequences, the implications, far-reaching implications of the events. So to think about the vibes of the time, if you want to think about life in general, the context, not necessarily the Jewish context, but the context in general. So the Iberian Peninsula was very much divided. Aragon and Castile were still two different kingdoms, of course, Granada, Portugal, Navarra, and so forth. So there was a lot of division in terms of political power. And much more important than that, the even in terms of each one of the kingdoms, there was a lot of decentralized power. So you essentially have kings, nobles, and you have the church, and those were three very strong powers. And we want to mention that because they have different interests when it comes to the Jews. Just to give you a sense, for example, in many cases, the Jews were understood as property of the crown, and yet they were working for nobles, and yet the church wanted to get them in one way or another. So the fact that it was such a decentralized political world didn't make things very easy. The other thing that is very important to understand is that this is a period of time in which religion was paramount. Everything was about religion. So it's not like today that religion exists, but it's sort of a marginal thing. But everything was about religion. And the concept of religion, in particular in the Christian world back then, was very different from what is now, in the sense that people were, they basically, there was no inconsistency, if you want, between being a cleric and having all your secular pursuits, including marriage and having kids and things like that. So there was a very fine distinction between the clerical, the ecclesiastic roles and the secular pursuits. One of the things that is something that has to be mentioned, because it's in the background of all of this, is that this was a period of time in which religious fanaticism, from the perspective of the Christianity in particular, because that's what we are talking about, throughout Europe, and in particular in the Iberian Peninsula, was rampant. Fanaticism, and fanaticism always brought with it anti-Semitism. The fanaticism in good part came from the fact that there were major plagues during the 1300s, and the plagues were devastating, the Black Plague. They were devastating. Half of Europe was killed. And of course, it's not surprise for us if I tell you that Jews were blamed some way, somehow, for the plagues. But more important than that, because of all of this environment, it almost like an apocalyptic feeling in a way. There were many monastic orders and grassroots movements in Christianity that became extraordinarily fanatic. And one of maybe the most important implications of that is that they had some procedures, in particular specific monastic order, the flagellants. The flagellants were people that would go with from city to city, from town to town, and they will flagellate themselves. They would make themselves bleed and suffer and everything. And of course, with blood and everything, you're exciting the masses. And that never ended up very well for the Jewish populations. This is the time also where all types of horrible anti-Semitic stereotypes develop, from Jews having tails to having horns, they have odors, all of that. This is when those wonderful stereotypes started. Another thing that's very important in terms of the Christian understanding of Judaism is that this is a period also that was marked by a new awareness in the Christian world about the importance of the Talmud. This is a very, very important point, again, very often neglected as a background to all of this, because basically, until around this time, maybe 100 years before or so, the type of polemics, the theological attacks to Judaism by Christians, the theological attacks were based on the Bible. And they were always baffled because we always had an answer to the things that were different from what they expected. And suddenly it dawned into the Christian leadership, mostly because of a number of Jews that converted that had knowledge about the Talmud and oral law in particular, that the Christians could not just use the Bible to convince the Jews about anything, because Judaism was rooted on the oral law as well as in the written law. And so the Talmud was a major source of strength for the Jewish people, it was a major source of argumentation and of a way of defending ourselves, but it also framed what Jewish life was. So for the Christians, for the Christians that were bound on, interested in giving the Jews a hard time, so to speak, this was an illumination that they have another set of books that we don't know, that is preventing them from seeing the light, so to speak. So the Talmud at this point became a very contentious issue. So we have two things going on. On one hand, you have all this fanaticism and anti-Semitism in general, and the other, this awareness of the Talmud and the role of the oral law in Judaism and how uncomfortable the different religious orders that wanted to convert Jews, how uncomfortable they were about that. Now, if you switch gears a little bit and not thinking about the context around the Jewish world, but the Jewish world itself in the Iberian Peninsula, at this point, there is no doubt that the Iberian Peninsula was the center of the Jewish world. You have an estimate of around 600,000 Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. This is just short of 10% of the total population of the Iberian Peninsula. And you have a presence that was completely widespread throughout the Iberian Peninsula. The major areas of settlement of Jews happened to be in Aragon and Castile. There were not a lot of Jews in Navarra. There were some, but not a lot of Jews in Granada. And there was a relatively large number of Jews in Portugal, but really, it's fair to say that if the Iberian Peninsula was the center of Jewish world, then Aragon and Castile were the center of the Jewish Iberian Peninsula. So it's a very large population. And it's not just large, it's also very strong in terms of rabbinic power. I mean, I have here just, I compiled without any effort a list of 40 rabbis, and I could have gone a little bit more, that were rabbis that made important contributions in this time period. This is the time period of Rabbi Hasdai Crescas, very, very famous, the Rabbi Nissim Gerondi from Girona, the Rabbi Isaac Perfect, Rabbi Shimon Tzemach Duran, the Aboab family, the Benveniste family, and you go on and on and on. So you have very, very strong rabbinic presence from an intellectual perspective. And of course, these names, I recognize that these names are not as recognizable as, for example, if you go a generation back, Nachmanides, Moshe ben Nachman, or if you go even another generation back, Maimonides. Understand, because this is not the golden era and it's not the silver era even anymore. But still, you have a very large presence of a very large number of extraordinarily productive, extraordinarily good leaders and thinkers. So it's a very vibrant community from that perspective. Of course, you can say that it's also in many respects a very, let's use the term cautiously, a very assimilated community, in the sense that they were, assimilated is not the right word. They were very much integrated into the society as well. Okay, so this is essentially where we are when we get to 1391. Now, the origin of the massacres of 1391 They come in the context mostly of an enormous degree of fanaticism by certain monastic orders, in particular the Dominicans. And we have to understand that behind these, behind the inflammatory speeches and sermons, and behind everything was also a power struggle between the Dominicans and other Christian groups. But the Dominicans were of the persuasion that the definition of forced conversion was a very open definition. Because the question really for all these Christian groups was, everybody wants to convert the Jews. Okay, they agree. But they also have, at least in the books, the idea that you cannot convert Jews by force. So the polemic becomes, the question becomes, how much force can you inflict on the Jews and still technically consider that it's not by force? Okay? How far can you go and it's still considered voluntary? Because otherwise it's not valid. And the Dominicans were really on the fringe of these, because for them, basically, everything would go and everything was justifiable. And therefore, they were very much in favor of a very aggressive posture in terms of conversion of Jews. And this posture also comes from the fact that this is a time, again, because of the plagues and everything, that there was a lot of an apocalyptic type of in the air. There was these apocalyptic views. Maybe the second coming is now, and if the second coming is now, we have to convert the Jews because the Jews have to witness to the second coming. And so there was a very strong theological background behind all of this. But for them, from the perspective of these Dominican orders, Dominican order and the Christians, the stakes were very high, because again, they thought that they were getting close to the ends of times. So these Dominican friar, the Ferrante Martinez, he developed a program, literally very systematic program, to deal with the Jewish problem in Seville. He lived in Seville, and the Dominicans were there. It was one of their headquarters. And so he developed a plan. And the first part of the plan would be to destroy all synagogues in town, then push Jews into a ghetto, and completely separate the Jews from the Christians, completely remove all Jews from any public positions and positions of influence. And of course, the kicker of all of these was, but if you convert to Christianity, that's no problem, then nothing of the above applies to you. So on one hand, you're destroying the foundations, the institutions. You're sort of trying to pull out the Jews from the fabric of society in general. But the idea is, okay, we are going to exempt those that convert, or that we force to convert, or whatever it may be. So everything would start with Seville and then would be applied to the rest of Spain. So this program was implemented in various stages. The activities, or if you want, the sermons to promote this program of dealing with the Jewish problem started several years before, more than a decade before, 1378. But the thing that's interesting is that in the beginning, for the next 10, 12 years of activity of this Fray Martinez and all his followers, they were not able to do anything because the crown was refusing to didn't allow them to do these things. Again, keep in mind that Jews were essentially property of the crown. So you don't let a bunch of fanatics to damage the assets of the crown. And by the same token that you would not allow people to go randomly and kill the horses that belong to the king, you not go around and kill the Jews that belong to the king. So again, you cannot do that. However, as very often happens, the leadership both of the Catholic Church and of the Crown, it changed. So the king died, the archbishop died, and that means that there is a little bit of a power vacuum now, and Fray Martinez and his followers use the opportunity to begin really trying to implement the plan that they for so long have been talking about. Initially, things didn't work very well, but to cut a long story short, they were able to recover and they were able to start a major attack on the Jewish population in Seville on the 6th of June of 1391. This was Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. And this was a horrible massacre. It was a horrible from any perspective. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And it started in Seville, but for the next 3 months, it was just a wild crowd, the mob going from city to city, stirring up the masses in different cities and killing Jews and destroying Jews and converting Jews by force. And it was open season on Jews for the next 3 months. And we are going to look a little bit at what happened, a lot of what happened, but it's enough to say, just to get a sense of how things worked, that first of all, the Jewish population as such was reduced in half, from about 600,000 to about 300,000. Of the 300,000, the best estimates that are obviously approximate, the best estimates are that about 100,000 were killed, about 100,000 were converted by force, and about 100,000 fled the country. So the population was reduced in half, and of that half, 100,000 were killed, 100,000 were exiled, and 100,000 or so were converted by force, with different degrees of force. So this, again, is gives you an idea of what the Iberian Peninsula was around that time, and gives you a pretty good idea also, as you're going to see, as things evolved. So
can I interrupt for a moment? The question
absolutely.
was the economic situation a stable one in general?
The economic situation was never a stable one in these times, much more so when you think about all the plagues and all the epidemics that they had at the time. The economic situation, of course, it's always a problem, because if the population is not happy, it's very easy to use Jews as scapegoats. On the other hand, there was always the issue that the Jews financed at different levels, in different ways, the crown. And in particular, in this time period, there was already a great participation of all these different kingdoms in the so-called Reconquista, that is basically driving the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula. There had been a big movement already, and a good part of the Iberian Peninsula, most of it had been already conquered from the Moors. If you look at that, we basically have just the kingdom, the Emirate of Granada, all the way here at the bottom. But all of these reconquista, all of this reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula costs a lot of money. And there was always an issue that the best way to solve the debts that you have to the Jews, the best way to liquidate the debts was very often to liquidate the Jews. And this was not trivial, because the debts were very, very strong. So you have a lot of poverty, you have very bad economic conditions in general, and in addition to that, you have you have the crown, the crown and the nobles depending a lot on the Jewish population, among others, in terms of financing. So, yes, however, I would dare say that the economic situation was relevant as the political situation was relevant, only in the sense that it sort of exacerbated the religious overtones of everything, right? If you feel that the economic situation is bad and everything is bad, and if you feel that you're getting close to the end of times because you see people dying in the plagues in the most horrendous ways, and again, half of the European population died in the two major plagues during this century. So it was not a small thing. All of that exacerbates the sort of the apocalyptic view of things. And if you have this exacerbation of the apocalyptic view of things, then you have two conflicting views. On one hand, you need Jews to come to be around to witness the second coming, and on the other hand, the Jews are the ones that are preventing the second coming from occurring. So you're guilty either way. What's the point? The point is that I don't think that the economic situation was of essence. I think, incidentally, that it was much more of the essence of the whole thing when you go to 1492 and the expulsion. That the economic issue is much, much stronger, in my view. I hope I answered the question. If I didn't, please feel free to come back and ask in a different way. Okay. So on June 6th of 1391, these massacres started, and of the 7,000 Jewish families that existed in Seville at that time, most were affected. There were 23 synagogues. All of them were destroyed. And not only that, some of them were transformed into churches, which was not that uncommon anyway. And there was a very large number of Jews, again, that were killed and that were converted by force, and some managed to escape as well. But what we are saying is that we have a very vibrant community in Seville that was destroyed, literally, around this date of the 6th of June. Rabbi Crescas of Zaragoza, and then actually he spent some time in Catalonia, in Barcelona as well. He basically is reporting to the Jews of Avignon, that's southern France, and they are reporting that what happened. And as a parenthesis, the Jews of Avignon was actually the headquarters of one of the popes. At this stage, there were 2 or 3 different popes, depends on the time frame. So there was the Pope, the anti-Pope, you name it. So there was a big conflict there, and one of the popes was in Rome and the other was in Avignon. So there is a connection there. So this is what Rabbi Crescas says. The Lord bent his bow like an enemy against the community of Seville. They set fire to the gates and killed many of its people, but most changed their religion, and some of the women and children were sold to the Muslims. And many died to sanctify his name, and many violated Holy Covenant. So this is a description around this time of what happened, and it's already telling you that some managed to escape, but many were killed and many were converted by force, or again, depends on how we define force. It continues then to Cordoba. Cordoba, of course, was the birthplace of Maimonides, was a very large community. And in Cordoba, what we are told is that, well, again, Rabbi Kreska says that great and small did not remain in it, who did not change their religion. Again, massive convergence by force. And it continues. We know that on the 20th, we reach Toledo. Okay, great Jewish presence in Toledo. And this is another quote, the horrible butchery that took place on the 17th of Tammuz. Of course, the 17th of Tammuz is a very sad day. It's a fast day in the Jewish. It's the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem at time of destruction of the Second Temple. So, and there were again many people killed, many converted by force, and the synagogues were destroyed and taken over. In particular, there were two synagogues. There are two places that are absolutely gorgeous in Toledo that were transformed into churches or cathedrals. One is the El Tránsito synagogue that, well, now it's a cathedral, and the Ibn Shoshan synagogue that now is the Cathedral of Santa Maria la Blanca. So this is, again, well, very, very strong and heartbreaking situation. And it continued. Then it goes to Burgos. Burgos is a very interesting place for many different reasons. But again, Rabbi Kreskes is telling us that Burgos is battered by the rage of the mob. And then it continues, choosing a base man, casting the honor aside. What that means that there were a number of people that actually converted that, and we're going to see a little bit more about that, because that was pretty dramatic. But so again, Burgos was destroyed, and I find interesting, and I don't mean to judge anything, but I find interesting that next to Burgos, there is still a town that goes by the name of Mata Judíos, which means kill Jews, to this day. So I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I think this is probably not the most, the nicest thing. But okay, and then it continues to Valencia. Valencia, the very, very large, again, killing, raping, and the same story on and on. In Palma de Mallorca, things were particularly bad, incidentally. In Palma de Mallorca, most people were baptized by force, and that actually explains why there was such a presence of crypto-Judaism, the Chuetas, in Palma for quite some time. This is just, for curiosity, a list of conversos in Palma de Mallorca, because they actually have they have good bookkeeping, and so they have the names of the people, the Hebrew names, and then the names that they adopted after. So there's a whole list of the conversos in Palma de Mallorca. And then towards the end, we are talking about Barcelona. Barcelona was a major Jewish area. And it was absolutely devastating. Barcelona was destroyed. The Jewish community in Barcelona was destroyed. And there were no Jews. There was no Jewish community in Barcelona for the next 500 years easily, until basically our days. And so that was a very horrible thing. And it was not just in Barcelona, in other parts of Catalonia, the same. Again, Rabbi Kreskas, he describes with great detail how the whole thing happened, how the people were able to find refuge in some of the castles and things like that, and then ended up being entrapped and killed. If you allow me the side note, because I've been talking about Rabbi Kreskas, and we got to Barcelona, there is a very interesting series produced by Spanish TV that is called the Owners of the Land. the owners of the land. And this is actually the second episode. The main focus is not the Jews, but in this second season, the owners of the land, the first season in Netflix is called Cathedral by the Sea. The second season is the owners of the land. And in the second season, it features a lot about this 1391 and Rabbi Kreskas and the Jewish population and everything. So, and surprisingly, it shows things in a very unvarnished way. So it shows the cruelty, it shows all those things. It also shows that Rabbi Kreskas died, which was not true. It was his son that died, but again, it is a series. So I recommend highly that, because again, it's a heartbreaking but a good unvarnished depiction of a lot of what was going on there. And then you have Girona, the great Girona, the great city of Girona in Catalonia, just a little far away from Barcelona, 30, 40, 50 miles. That was one of the major sources, or one major headquarters of Jewish learning, destroyed. Girona was destroyed completely. So this is what Rabbi Kreskas is saying from Girona. In the city of Girona, where learning and humility were joined in one place, the rabbis of the community publicly sanctified the holy name. That means that they were killed, they were martyred. But few of the people changed their religion, and most took shelter in the homes of the Christian townsmen. Now they are in the castle, and then ended up being killed, most of them. So pretty much the last area to be, the last city to be destroyed, the Jewish population, was in Lerida. And you can see here these two circles, that things started in Seville, and then they start going all the way, and ended up, so they go all the way from Castile to Aragon. Basically, both Navarra right there, Granada, and the Kingdom of Portugal, they were not affected by this, but all of these areas, so you see Toledo, in Madrid, and so forth. So it was like an arch, all this area affected. So this was the last town, and the Jews of the city, again, Rabbi Kreskas is saying, they vainly thought, they tried to get protection in the castle. 75 of them were slain, and the rest were baptized. And the synagogue was transformed into a church. And the thing that's ironic about that is that in that church, that is now a church, that's the church with all the Jews that were converted by force went. So that was sort of a little bit of an hallucination. It's altered states of consciousness situation, because, I mean, you have a new church that is really just for people that are really not Christians yet, and they are in the same place that they were before, except that it was a synagogue and now it's a church again. So after these 3 months of riots, we have exactly what I mentioned to you, that is about 70 Jewish communities were obliterated, they were exterminated, that you have about 100,000 Jews killed, 100,000 Jews exiled, and 100,000 Jews converted. So this is a paradigm shift. And here I sort of getting into more of concluding thoughts, although these are concluding, but are also the platform for other discussions. And that is, one of the greatest implications of these events is that you end up with the Jewish people that are Jewish culturally, if you want, people that identify as Jewish, that were Jewish all their lives, that they didn't know anything else. Basically, now we have the Jewish people divided in 3 groups. We have the Jews that remain Jewish. Basically, you have the 300,000 that managed not to be directly affected. You have Jews that converted to Christianity, but in this group you have, if you want to distinguish it the way, you have two groups. You have Jews that converted to Christianity, and they just wanted to be good Christians. There are some examples of that I'll mention to you in a moment. But then there was a very large number of Jews that they pretended to be Christian, but they didn't want to be Christian, and they were still doing Jewish things. Now, notice that for both conversos and the Moranos, these two groups of Jews that were converted by force, they have their family next door. All the family was around. The family that remained Jewish, they were around. So, first of all, they have communications with the family. They have information from the family. They could get, so to speak, kosher food from the family if they wished. So it was very difficult to separate them, and it was very difficult for the Christians to prevent the existence of crypto-Judaism in one way or another. Now, it's important to mention, however, that there were cases of Jews that converted with gusto. Maybe the most interesting case, sadly interesting, is the case of Rabbi Shlomo Alevi, that was the chief rabbi of Burgos. He converted. We know that he converted on the July 21st, together with his children. And one of the things that was very often done to these important people that were that converted, in particular willingly, was to give them very high positions. And in the fact, Rabbi Shlomo Alevi, he became the Archbishop of Burgos with the name of Pablo de Santa Maria. Pablo de Santa Maria, if you go to Burgos today, you still find monasteries that he created. You still find his presence. Most of the people go there and they don't have the slightest idea that the Archbishop, the great Pablo de Santa Maria, was actually Rabbi Shlomo Alevi that converted to Christianity with his children. One interesting point, fascinating, his wife never converted, which means that, and they still lived together. This was an absolutely horrible situation, not uncommon, but horrible. His wife never converted. And to his shame, he arranged that his wife, when she died, she was buried in the Cathedral of Burgos, together with him when he died, and then with his son, one of his children, that became the next Archbishop, Alfonso de Cartagena, that was son of Pablo of Burgos. And so basically, you have the wife that never converted being buried in the crypt of the cathedral in Burgos. You can still visit now. So the question now is where do we go from here? The problems from Jewish people were enormous. The problems for the Christians were enormous. That were situation. For the Jewish people, this was, I mean, I don't have to explain why this was horrible, right? But keep in mind that aside from all the killings and aside from all the exiles, you have families that are divided right in the middle, like Pablo de Santa Maria, that he's a Archbishop and the wife never wanted to convert and never did. And this was not uncommon, as I said. So it's a lot of tension. And you start having to deal. So what happens if people want to come back to Judaism? How do we deal with that? If somebody wants to get divorced, how do we deal with that? If one is Jewish, the other converted. In terms of inheritance, does the inheritance of somebody that converted, and if the parents didn't, is he entitled to inheritance? There were all types of halachic problems, of legal problems, aside from the family problems, aside from all the logistic problems and emotional problems that exists. Now, for the Christians, there were also very serious problems. One of the problems that was a pretty obvious one was that those Jews were not particularly good Catholics, even if they wanted to be, most of them, because they didn't know anything about their religion, the new religion. So, I mean, they could go to church and do whatever, but that doesn't mean that overnight they learned everything. They didn't. So they were not very good Christians. That's the immediately. Then you still have the issue of different sects within Christianity trying to decide how much force can you apply and still consider the conversion voluntary. That is an issue that didn't disappear. And to that, you have to add another very explosive, if you want, component, which is the fact that all these Jews that were converted, now there was absolutely nothing to prevent them from becoming all that they could be in the society of Castile and Aragon. They could rise to the top, and they did. And this is where the problems start, because you have all these people that rise to the top of the hierarchy, that become the best, become very prominent in the finances, in the political, even in the church. And you have a whole bunch of them that are not good Christians at all. So this is hypocritical, they say. So never mind that people were converted by force, but the fact is that now they have access to everything, so they have all the luxury of being Christians, but they are not good Christians. And that creates a lot of economic and sociological problems. And I like to see how high we made it, so to speak, in the Spanish society. I'm 2 minutes from finishing. How high we made it is illustrated by the fact that the patron saint of Spain, Santa Teresa de Avila, she comes from a Jewish family. So even their patron saint is from a new Christian family. So this leads us to the next few steps. And the next step actually is the disputation of Tortosa in 1414. So basically 20 years after, which is another horrible development that it sort of adds insult to injury. And if you want to know more about that, you have to tune back next week at the same time. I'll be talking about the disputation of Tortosa. But all of these sets the stage for everything that happens leading to the expulsion of 1492. I just give you a thought. The whole concept of Judaism as a race, the purity of blood, all of that comes to the surface this period when the Spaniards look at these Jews that, oh, now they are Christians, and by the life of us, we cannot take the Jew out of them, or they are not good Christians, or whatever it is. So this is when develops the idea that, oh, Judaism is actually not exactly a religion or a people, is a race. And you can change people's religion, you can change people's nationality, but you cannot change people's race. And therefore, the moment Judaism is a race, you only have two alternatives: either kill them or expel them. Converting them is not that appealing anymore. And that's how we get to 1492. But again, to get more information of what happens in the 1400s, I invite you to come back 1 week from today. Drora.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I was going to give a little plug there in between while people are writing their questions in, and you gave it. So yeah, we hope to see people back next week to continue the conversation. And make sure to send in some questions before if there are things you want clarified and things. I do want to add, while people are writing in questions, that we have added a separate talk on Syria through the lens of Michelle Gordon, who went there about 15, 20 years ago and has taken some pictures and has done a lot of research on it. So I invite you to come back. So we have next week with Rabbi Pereira and December 22nd with Michelle Gordon. And we have a question. You will get a link for the next sessions in the follow-up email, and the link to rewatch this or to share this program too. So those are the logistic questions. Now let's go to the actual questions. So Dvora, I'm going to allow you to open your microphone because I think based on what Rabbi Pereira followed up, you might want to tweak your question a little. So you now have the option to open your microphone. In the meantime, while you're thinking about it, there's the question of how did Rabbi Kreskas manage to survive in order to be able to write down all these letters?
Well, I mean, not everybody was in the path of destruction. That's one of the things. Although he was in Zaragoza at the time, and Zaragoza was affected. But look, it's not as if people didn't know what was coming. When you see things coming closer and closer, you know. And so he was one of the lucky ones. But notice that he escaped, but one of his children did not. So it's one of those. And many rabbis escaped. So half of the Jewish people in the Iberian Peninsula, 300,000, were not directly affected. And then again, many important rabbis escaped. But what is interesting is that all these rabbis that escaped, they are left with a big quandary. And this is a theological quandary, which is, I'm looking at these people, I'm looking at the Jewish people, and this is true also then after the disputation of Tortosa for next week. We'll talk about that in more detail. But how is it that these 100,000 people that were converted by force, how is it that they didn't reject Christianity immediately and came back? How is it that you have people like the Rabbi of Burgos that becomes a fanatic Christian? How is it? What is it? What is it? Is it that we are too much into philosophy? And so there was a big debate and there were enormous attacks to philosophy, enormous attacks to the standards of Maimonides and others. There was an outburst of mysticism, which of course also goes very well with the horrible situation. And in between everything, which is a story in and of itself, there was a little bit of a resurgence of the Karaim. There was a Jewish sect that only accepted the written law, not the oral law. And there was a resurgence because they were less, I mean, they were also victimized by the Christians, but less, a little bit less. So, but again, thank God, half of the Jewish population was able to survive, including Rabbi Kreskas and many others. Yeah.
So there are a few more questions coming in. Devora, again,
Yes. Hi.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Rabbi. Here,
Hello.
the Dominicans weren't like a monolithic brotherhood, and I read in different places that the Dominicans were vicious and fomented pogroms. You call them massacres, same thing, and basically got the people lower echelon in society, with sickles and whatever, and just pillaged Jewish communities. But it's interesting you described the Dominicans during this period in the part of the 1300s, the later part of the 1300s, as sort of measured. And I'm just wondering, what your sources for that were, and maybe in a more general role, like what role the monks played in this period of time against the Jews.
So first of all, the Dominicans, it's look like any other group. They were not a monolithic group. What they were was a group that had a very large number of very fanatic people. And we talked about Fray Martinez, but maybe even more famous is Fray Vicente Ferrer, that started his activities around this time, and then throughout the next few decades, So that they were very loud, so to speak. It's interesting. It's mostly at the popular level, not necessarily at the level of the leadership. And this is something that we find consistently throughout the different time periods, throughout the next century, the next couple of centuries, in different parts, is that the further up you go in the Catholic hierarchy, the less, let's use the term, less obnoxious they were. In many cases, these lower level, middle of the road monks, they were doing all these things against the will of their leaders, but they were very popular. One of the other things also, if you want to follow up a little bit on this, and maybe to our surprise today, one of the institutions that was always very much trying to refrain, trying to curb the enthusiasm, if you want, of the different monastic orders, in particular the Dominicans, was the Pope, the Papal States. The Papal States were surprisingly, I mean, they were not very friendly, mind you, but they were not particularly, they were accepting Jewish refugees when they were being expelled from Spain. So, and of course, the Papal States at the time, they were probably more than half of what the Italian peninsula is. It's not like the Vatican now. And the Dominicans, again, being or not being monolithic, they are always in the more fanatic fringe of all these things. And if you go a little bit further with the Inquisition, and they were obviously very much in charge of the Inquisition, at least in most places. And this is where things get really interesting. For them, for the Dominicans, being in charge of the Inquisition, it was not just a rhetorical question, the issue of how much force can you impose upon Jews and convert them and still consider this voluntary. This was not a rhetorical question. It was not a theological question. It was a very practical question. Why? For a very simple reason. The Inquisition officially, okay, by definition, only had jurisdiction over lapsed Christians, not over Jews. So, literally speaking, you could not arrest a Jew for being Jewish through the Inquisition. We have those examples, for example, with when the Portuguese Jews left from Brazil in the 1600s, that the Inquisition let the Jews leave Brazil, but not the Jews that have been baptized. So from their perspective, it had to be the case that you could basically do anything and still consider it voluntary. Because if you don't consider the conversion valid, then they don't have jurisdiction over the Jews. So again, because of all of these things, the Dominicans really, they have a certain reputation that I dare say is well deserved.
Yes, thank you. And my question was about the new Christians, like the recently converted Jews. The Dominicans and the Inquisition were incredibly vicious toward them, and you did explain why. Thank you.
Yeah.
And to expand upon that, somebody asked if the Jesuits also played into that in a certain way.
The Jesuits are a little bit more academic, let's say. The Jesuits are, well, again, the Dominicans were really the
logistics
in all of this. And look, and everything is relative. It doesn't mean that the other monastic orders were very nice and historically not. But the bad guys at this particular time period, and maybe the next couple of 100 years, were the Dominicans. Then in other contexts, the Jesuits, for example, the Jesuits were pretty nasty in the colonies, in particular in the African colonies, in the Asian colonies of Portuguese colonies. They were pretty nasty there. But that's already a little bit later. And then you have other orders, the the order of the Knights of Malta. That's another one that they were sort of the follow-up order, the order that inherited the tradition of the order of the Hospitaliers. The Hospitaliers were a very strong order during the Crusades, and they were disbanded at some point for whatever political reasons, and the Knights of Malta replaced them. They exist to this day. And the Knights of Malta were, throughout the 1600s and the good part of the 1700s, they were in charge of the slave trade of Jews in the Mediterranean. I mean, that was their business. But I mean, it was not just Jews, but they, in 1799, when Napoleon invaded Malta and basically ended their reign, Napoleon writes that there was about 1,000 Jews that were there enslaved. It was a very good business. And incidentally, don't think for a second that taking Jewish hostages and selling them for exorbitant price, it's a modern invention. It's not. It has been around for a long time. You have halachic discussions suggesting that, yes, you should rescue the captives, Pidyon Shvi'im, yes, but you have to go out of the way not to pay an exaggerated price, because otherwise you're just incentivizing them to get more captives. So these issues in Jewish law that we are facing now that are breaking our hearts, okay, in Israel and everything, those issues, unfortunately, are not new.
I'm going to pick up on something you said to ask another question here. You said the Jesuits were more educated. And one of the questions is, were the more highly educated usually less racist than the commoners?
Being more educated means that they are more aware of certain things. So, look, you can be, in terms of being a bigot, I sort of would prefer an ignorant bigot than a very intelligent one, because a very intelligent one can be very dangerous. But the Jesuits have a much more acute sense of history. Now, they, for example, if you go to the 1700s, 1800s, they thought that part of the process of evangelizing was to teach the natives, to teach how to write, to teach the language. So all of those things that today we don't think were very particularly nice, because it was basically canceling their cultures. But so they were into that, which means that they were trying to introduce Christianity through soft power, as opposed to. So you bring the Indians, so to speak, to the Christian schools, and you naturally make them into Christians because you are teaching them. So it's a little bit of a different approach. And I cannot resist telling you a story. Of course, in the United States, you have several institutions that are very reputable, that are Jesuit run. Georgetown University, Boston College, for example, Santa Clara University. Those are Jesuit institutions. And I have a fascinating story of, at some point, just already many years ago, over 20 years ago, I went to give a talk in one of these institutions, the Jesuit institution. And it was a little bit uncanny because I'm not used to talking and having in front of me half of the audience are either priests or nuns, but whatever. But they were very nice, and they invited me to meet the dean and all that type of stuff. And the dean starts asking me questions about Jewish history and things like that. And I'm cringing. I mean, I don't want to talk about this. I mean, please. And he tells me, Rabbi, it seems that you feel that Jews are the only ones that know about the atrocities that the Catholics and the Jesuits did back in time. We already know. We also know about that. I said, okay, that's refreshing, but you can talk about it as much as you want. I would rather not, because I never know. I mean, whatever. Yeah. God knows what. Yeah. But it was very refreshing to have that answer. You're not the only ones who know about those things.
So, no, that is good to know, actually.
Yeah.
There are quite a few more questions. Some of them are going to be answered in follow-up sessions, so I encourage you to keep listening. I want to be conscious of the time. So there are some wonderful comments also. I will send them to you, Rabbi Pereira, about how wonderful you are, and I second that as well. So I do want to mention that, and we look forward to having you back next week and continuing the
Sure.
conversation.
And
Again, I will
everybody
send
that
you
has
questions.
Sure. Everybody that has questions also feel free to ask for my email address, and you can either go through Drawer or send the questions to me. Either way.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's perfect. Thank you so much, everyone.
Very
Have a
good.
wonderful
Thank you.
rest of your day, wherever you are. And thank you.
Thank you.